Welcome to Growing Up B2B. I'm Delia, and I'm the second generation president of Delia Associates. We are the place where B2B brands go to grow. Hello, and welcome to Growing Up B2B. I'm your host, Delia, and second generation president of Delia Associates, the place where B2B brands go to grow. Very excited about today's guest. His name is John Hart, and he's the managing director for PMCF, a middle market investment bank that provides merger and acquisition advisory services to individual and family-owned businesses, as well as large public companies and private equity firms all around the world. John leads the firm's plastics and packaging group and has completed numerous transactions in these industries during his time with PMCF. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Hey, in reading your bio, you weren't always attached to the investment banking industry. For a period of time, you ran a distribution company. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so I guess before I get into that, maybe a little bit of background on why I ended up at the distribution company. But I grew up in a family business. In fact, that business is still run by my father today. He's your classic entrepreneur who doesn't know how to retire. I grew up in the business from a very early age. It's really a construction and finishing and painting and wall covering business, regional in Michigan. And so I grew up working in that business in the summers. And then during college, I went to Michigan State. I was working in the business full time. The plan was for me to take over the business, but it was about midway through college, I discovered investment banking.
Oh, okay.
I took a class and a really dynamic professor at Michigan State University. And I fell in love with investment banking. I said, that's what I was meant to do.
Okay.
And so I started off my career. So Michigan State was not a college at the time that recruited for investment banking. So I started off in really more of a valuation services at an accounting firm and quickly found my way to Plant Moran, or PMCF. We're affiliated with Plant Moran, a large accounting firm. And it was a couple years into my investment banking career, a board advisor to my father's company asked me to come run his company. And there was basically a hint that he might be selling it. So I jumped at the opportunity to basically work on the other side of a deal where I was running a company and helping that company sell. We hired an investment banker. I was doing the road shows with the owner and the owner's son. And it was about a 2.5 year experience. And I did not go to grad school like a lot of investment bankers. And I always tell people that's my grad school, was
That's right.
working in that distribution company, family owned, just really well-established business. And it was just a great learning experience for me that I still draw upon today when I work with families and entrepreneurs. When I'm sitting across the table from the management team or from the owners, I remember sitting on the other side of the table and what it felt like.
Wow. Okay. So you've got a real 360 view of all of this dynamic, both being from the family business, running a business, and now helping businesses with various transitions and transactions. Let me ask you, so your area of specialization, plastics and packaging, how did you arrive at that as an area of focus?
Yeah, so at PMCF, we are industry specialists. So we focus on select areas of business. We have 5 industry verticals. Plastics and packaging is one of them. And I'd love to say that I discovered that and launched it. The firm already had it when I
Okay.
joined. And I didn't even pick it. It chose me.
Okay.
But I was fortunate that it chose me and I really enjoyed it and learning about it early on. It was more of a plastics vertical when I joined in the early 2000s. It was still called the plastics and packaging, but it was largely plastic manufacturing. I worked on a packaging deal early on and just fell in love with packaging. And so we've really bolstered the packaging side of the firm. Legacy wise, very strong in plastics manufacturing and distribution. But since I've taken over the leadership of the vertical, it's been about 17 years now. We've really added a lot of expertise in packaging. And so it really is a true plastics and packaging vertical. That's really what's evolved over the years.
Understood. Understood. So along the PMCF journey, I understand that many of the transactions that you've supported, as well as your colleagues there, were on behalf of family govern businesses. Is that right?
Yes, I'd say that the firm, so we turned 30 this year, so founded in the mid 90s. Our firm kind of grew up basically advising families and entrepreneur-owned businesses in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And that at that point in time, private equity really hadn't taken off. Today, private equity is involved in just about every industry segment, and there's thousands of private equity groups. But back in the early days, it was more family founders or large corporations. We chose to work with family founders. Family founders is still a very substantial part of our practice today, maybe two-thirds, depending on the year. But private equity, just with its growth and the proliferation of private equity, we advise private equity-owned clients, and we do some large corporate. But really, the foundation of our practice is with family and entrepreneurs. And candidly, I really enjoy it, advising somebody through the most meaningful transaction of their life. And many times it spans generations. I've worked with businesses where the second or third generation are running the business, but the first or the second generation is still around. And that tension that exists between the first and the second, or the second and the third generation, where they're not letting go, not letting the next gen kind of run the business. And a lot of times the kids will confide in me, and then the owners will confide in me, and I'll stand in the middle. And so it's something that I take a lot of satisfaction from in terms of helping somebody through A, something they've never done in their lives, B, just the most meaningful transaction of their lives, and then C, it's a very emotional process. And we set up our processes, we've set up our whole practice to cater to those types of sellers so that we can help them effectively manage through all the dynamics that come about.
That's a great point, and certainly emotion plays a huge role in these types of transactions. So, how do you help ownership balance the financial and the emotional aspects of a transaction? How do you help keep them in balance?
Yeah, so I would say first, and this is something a little different about our firm versus others, is we like to get involved early. We have an approach, it's really called a strategic assessment, but it's a tool we use for transaction planning. So if somebody's considering a sale, or if they're thinking about, okay, how do I pass the business on to the second generation or the third generation? How does that work, and what are my options relative to that? And so we like to get involved early. We use the strategic assessment as a tool, and then we approach it with, hey, we're here to help. We're here to help you sort this out. And a lot of times, if it's a business owner that's thought about, maybe I'm going to sell, maybe I'm not, I don't really know, they'll talk to our competitors, and our competitors will try to sell them on selling, which is something that really bothers me, candidly, because their incentive, obviously, to sell and to sell businesses. So are we, but we approach it totally different. So a lot of times I'll get a call and somebody will say, hey, I'm interested in selling. And I always ask them, why do you want to sell? What's driving the reason to sell? And then we start down a path of helping them figure out really what's the why. And then if the why makes sense, and we challenge them on the why, and let's say they get to a point of, okay, it makes sense for them, then it's when. Because sometimes, or a lot of times, selling a business, when we're having the first conversation, the company's not ready. The owners aren't ready. And maybe the market isn't ideal. We always look at transactions in kind of those three buckets, if you will. So we have the shareholder bucket. Why do they want to do something? What's driving it? There might be multi-generation, there might be multiple families. We try to understand that dynamic and really what's driving it, what makes sense for them. There's cycles of companies, right? You don't want to sell a company when it's on a down cycle. You also don't want to sell it too early into an up cycle. Or maybe a company just made a major investment in capital, or they just put in a new facility. A lot of times that's not the best time to be considering a sale. And then obviously the market goes up and down. So you ideally want to catch it when it's going up or it's at a peak. And so we look at those three things in the planning phase. using our strategic assessment tool to help them. And sometimes, like our mutual client, CMG Plastics, who we recently sold, I worked with them for 10 years, just working them through. They knew sometime in the future they would need to consider sale. They wanted to build the business to ultimately sell it, but they didn't know anything about selling a business. They didn't know when would be the right time. And our approach was, we'll advise you. And we became part of the team, and we brought the M&A perspective to the shareholder group. And it was through that that we ultimately completed a successful transaction for them last fall. And that is very similar to how we work with families. And I think that long-term view of the world, the more consultative approach, and then putting together a plan. And the plan doesn't have to be super complicated or sophisticated, but putting together a plan and then working alongside of the shareholder group to execute that plan is how we're able to be successful, I believe, in the transactions. And if you talk to any one of our clients, they were happy with the service we provided, but it wasn't just a phone call. Next thing, we put their company out to market and we close it. It's just not how it works.
Yeah, and that was certainly seeing the other side of that tremendous appreciation for how you worked with them, how you became really an advisor to them before any transaction was even on the table, and were able to really guide that early and be part of that process early. Would you say that's really part of what makes a transaction successful as we look to the family governed business, that having that longer view? Would you say that's a key to success, or are there others that really make maybe that particular deal or similar other ones successful?
Yeah, in terms of the long-term view, I think that approach applies to a lot of situations. Most of the time, the families aren't ready and they need time to process. And there's things that can be done, whether it be succession or backfilling roles or upcoming retirements, or within the company. There's always things that can be done in a company to optimize it. And so a lot of times that culminates into a long-term view, but that isn't always the case. I have met with companies that maybe they've done their homework and they've been preparing for many years, and we're helping them more on the fringes. And maybe they're closer to being ready for a transaction. But the key is being ready, and then making sure that that shareholder group or the family, whoever it is, understands the dynamics of the transaction, understands all the intricacies of it, and then they get ready and we get them ready. So however long that takes, and then it's working through the company side. There's a lot of things that go into a transaction, and I would say most companies aren't ready to take that on right away. Some are, but most aren't. And so it's, where are their deficiencies and how do we shore up those deficiencies before we go to market? And then the third piece, the market, a lot of times it's the segment which in the company operates. There's unique market dynamics within that segment. And so we watch those, we track those. We've been tracking both plastics and packaging, every publicly disclosed transaction globally since 2005. And our goal there is to make sure that we have the pulse of not only the general market in those broad industries, but each segment within those industries, so that we can properly advise a selling shareholder as to the optimal timing.
Nice, nice.
And really the optimal buyer, because there are different types of buyers out there. We talked a little bit about private equity earlier. Private equity isn't for everybody. And don't try to sell private equity. There's some good private equity. There's a really good option in private equity. Again, it's not for everybody. There's a lot of different types of strategic transactions. And so just educating the shareholders on those types of transactions, and then seeking out and identifying the best fit for the selling shareholder. Most of the time we're on the sell side, but I always tell people that I want the deal to work on both sides. Because if you sell a business and it turns out not to be a good deal, well, there's a lot of employees, sometimes there's family members working in that business, post-close, and you want it to go. And
Yes.
so it's really vetting those buyers, making sure that there's consistent values and culture in the business, and they're looking at the business. We have a whole process that we call seller due diligence. Most of the time when you're selling a business, it's all about the buyer's due
Yeah.
diligence. About 15 years ago, I implemented seller due diligence. And I basically told my client, I'm like, you could ask the buyer whatever you want. We can go visit their plants. We can go talk to their people. We can talk to people that pack the products, to other acquisitions they've done, to everybody on their management team. There's nothing that's off limits. But ultimately, we want to do our homework and we want to pick the best buyer for the business.
That's a tremendous insight, and you don't hear that very often. So that's thinking back to the scenario that we referenced earlier. If I recall, their first thought about the eventual buyer was a pass, right? Until they started to peel back the layers and say, wait a minute, maybe we're not seeing things the way we should be, and then their sentiments definitely shifted over time. Talk for a minute about where do things, when it comes to the family-owned business, what are some of the challenges? Where can things go wrong when they're contemplating a sale, an acquisition, or some form of transaction?
Well, with family founder businesses, I'd say one of the key things that I see, and this is broadly, not all family businesses are like this, but it's a general issue, is that if it's first gen or even second gen, a lot of times there's a key man issue or key woman issue where the leader, the shareholder, is doing too much and they don't have enough infrastructure that to really allow them to get out of the day to day. And so that's something when I first get involved, I always try to understand how much are the owners working? What are they doing? What kind of team do they have beneath them? What's their involvement in the day to day? What's their involvement with customers? Some of these owners are still doing pricing or they're doing purchasing of the product. And I think that's generally a red flag with a buyer because there's an over reliance on one person. That's where time can be helpful. If we get involved 3 to 5 years before a sale, we can help the owners identify that. A lot of times they know it, but they need an outsider to tell them, hey, you're doing too much. You need to backfill these functions or these roles. And so I would say that's one. Another is just general books and records and financial controls and even external financial statements, data to track performance of the business, monthly financial statements being closed in a timely manner, key performance indicators in the business. I've seen so many businesses over the years where that part of the company is below par. And whether they need a leader to come in and implement that, or they have maybe the person, but just not the systems or the capabilities or the processes. And so that's something that we see a lot that we bring up. And then I would say there's a lot of others, but a lot of these family founder businesses have customer concentration, which creates a challenge in a transaction. And they a lot of times know it, but they don't understand the magnitude of the impact it could have on a transaction. And so that's something that we generally flag right away if it is there, and then advise them, hey, what can you do to diversify the business and lower the reliance on a one, two, or three customers in your business so that when you do go to sell the business, you have a more diversified business to sell.
And the key people in place, absent the owner who can provide the functions for continuity so that it's less owner dependent, is key as well, per your previous point.
We do a lot with management teams, and management teams sometimes in these family founder businesses have grown up in the business. So they don't have maybe as much of an outside perspective. And the thought of selling a business or going through a sale, they immediately think, okay, I'm going to lose my job, which is most of the time not the case. If they're a good employee or a good manager, and they're performing well, buyers do deals to acquire talent.
Yeah.
But I would say that a lot of these management teams of family founder-owned businesses, they freak out when they hear about a potential sale. And so the same approach that I do with families and founders, I sit down and go through a whole process with management teams, first to assess them, but second, to really get them comfortable and educate them on not only the process, but what life would look like post sale and what opportunities could exist, for these businesses. A great example of that is a company we sold out in your area, Stoll Technologies.
Sure.
And I don't know if you know the Stoll brothers,
Yes.
but they were essentially running the business with an outside president. I was brought in, and each of the brothers were playing critical roles in the business. We sold to a private equity box strategic, and those brothers all retained their jobs, but some of them more so than others in terms of took elevated roles in the combined entity. It really turned out to be a fantastic career opportunity for each of them. But I would say initially when I was talking to them, they weren't necessarily excited about the prospects of being sold.
Yeah. Understood. So I have to ask you this question. When somebody comes forward and you start talking with them, do you find that when it comes to valuation of the business, they might have, let's just say, unrealistic expectations, or have they more or less done some homework and have more of a realistic idea of what their business may be worth, or is that something you have to walk them through?
Yeah, I would say 10 years ago, it was more they didn't know and they had a general sense, but I would tell them before we take any company to market, I mentioned the strategic assessment tool that we
Mhm.
utilize. Strategic assessment is really we look at the business like a buyer would, and we give our clients the perspective of the buyers without having to go to market. And so, as part of that, we tell them what their estimated market value. If we were to take your business to market today, here's how a buyer would look at it, here's how they would value it, and here's what to expect. 10 years ago, I'd do that. And there were times where owners like, wow, my business is worth that much. Like they were surprised at how valuable the business is. I would say today, with the proliferation of articles on M&A, all these webinars, industry events, there's an M&A session, people publish multiples and they say, oh, the multiples are this and multiples are that. And business owners a lot of times will take a multiple that was set at an industry event. Sometimes it's one that I said, and they will just apply it to their earnings, and it may or may not be accurate
Right.
because a multiple to me is a byproduct of the value instead of the driver of the value. And within the plastics and packaging industry, the valuation range is 5 to about 14 times your
Quite a range.
EBITDA, which is a profit metric we use for those that
Mhm.
don't know that. And so 5 to 14 is a pretty big range,
That's a
right?
big range.
And there's unique dynamics within different segments. Obviously, if you give me a segment, I can narrow it down. The more the size of the business plays into it, the segment that they're in. We talked about concentration before, the diversity of the business, the profit levels of the business, the capital intensity of the business. There's a lot that go into it. We do that as part of our strategic assessment. And I would say that nowadays, there are times where I'm telling them, no, your business isn't worth that. It's not worth a 10 multiple. It's worth an 8 multiple because of these reasons. And just because somebody said a 10 multiple at a conference doesn't mean that specifically applies to your business. It's a generalization.
I'm starting to really realize how some of the tools you put in place are valuable because business owners have funny hearing. Because I'm a business owner, you said 5 to 14. I heard 14, right? But you said 5 to
Yeah.
14. I just heard the 14, right? And you got to
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
no, that's why there's a range. And here's the tool we use to figure out where in the range you reside currently, right?
Yeah,
So,
well, and that's a funny thing you say that because in our strategic assessments, we give them a range.
mhm.
Generally, it's within one turn of their profitability. So let's say we valued a business at 8 to 9 times EBITDA. Let's just say that was 80 to 90 million. And they hear 90 million. So, oh, my business is worth 90. I'm like, no, it's 80 to 90. That's the range. We don't know exactly the value of your business is what somebody's willing to pay for it. But based on what we know of the buyers in your segment, this is the range.
Right.
And so and then as we get into the process, it's the same type of thing. So there's multiple bid rounds in a process. So the initial bid round is called an indication of interest. The second bid round is called a letter of intent. A lot of people know what a letter of intent is, but the indication of interest is a very high level soft offer. If offers come in really high in that range, a lot of times the business owners will latch onto that. And I'll be like, no, that's just a high level offer. It's not until you get to a letter of intent that you can really fix on a valuation or evaluation range.
So the other value that I'm seeing from working with you, John, is it seems like you really take the time to walk them out the path every step of the way and giving them a lot of guidance and pre-guidance as to here's what's going to happen next, so that no rash decisions are made or no emotions don't overtake the more rational thinking about the transaction, which is, I guess, really crux to the value that you bring, is really walking the path with them every step of the way.
Plant Moran's 100 years old. PMCF's 30 years old, but really the DNA of the firm is to be the trusted advisor to the client, not just providing a service, really be that advisor on the inner circle. And so that approach really resonated with me when I joined the firm, because I talked about my roots in family business and then me working with this distribution business early on. I really look to become that advisor to the client. And the reason why we have these tools, the reason why we take the approach that we do, is because we think that's what is necessary and what these clients really need to figure out, A, what they want to do. And then once they figure out what they want to do, help them implement and maximize it in a transaction.
Excellent, excellent. So as we're about to wrap up here, what's one final piece of advice that you might give to a family business leader or leadership team that's thinking about an eventual exit or eventual transition?
Yeah, so first it would be find an advisor that is not going to try to sell you on selling. Find an advisor that takes an approach like we do, that can really give you the outside perspective and walk you through all the nuances of what it really means to sell a business and all the steps that go into it. And then that'd be number one. Number two would be to have somebody evaluate not the shareholder base and the company to figure out the optimal timing on when to do it. So if there's a decision to do it, evaluate both shareholder, company, market, really evaluate the timing. And I'd say in order to do that, you need to be patient and start early. So I always advise, like, I want to get involved as early as possible. And so I always say, if somebody calls me and they're just picking my brain, I'm like, do you have plans to sell in the next 3 to 5 years? And if the answer is yes, I say, there's stuff you should be doing now. And that surprises a lot of people. I'll say, wait a minute, that's a long time out. 3 to 5 years is not a lot of time in the deal world.
No.
For us to basically, from the time somebody says we want to sell versus the time you sell, it's generally at least a year. And then sometimes there's a year or two of prep that goes in. So if you go 3 to 5 years, you got to start right now. If you're going to sell in 3 years. Doesn't mean we can't do it sooner,
Sure.
but it's more about optimizing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think patience was such a key word to wrap up on, because it's patience that you bring, the patience and discipline that your firm brings, your process brings, and then instilling the patience in that person on the other end to know how to walk the path correctly and to know that, what their time horizon is. They really need to be sometimes patient about when that transaction will happen. And that can be hard, right? That can be hard. If any of our listeners were at a point where they wanted to reach out to you, start a conversation, or reach out to PMCF in general, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yes, probably the best way is our website, pmcf.com. You can go to the About Us, the team section. All my contact information is there. I publish it, which It can be painful sometimes because you get a lot of spam, but we want to be accessible to people. So you can reach out to myself or anybody at the firm. I give you my phone number, my email, or you can even just do a general website inquiry. But we're on LinkedIn as well. You can find us there. But probably the best way, a lot of our initial discussions are very confidential and we treat them as such. So a phone call or an email probably makes the most sense.
Okay, great, great. And certainly, and as noted on the website, John, given your tenure in the plastics and packaging industries, lots of great resources, knowledge, takeaways, writings that you've put forth as well in those categories. If you are in one of those industry sectors, a lot of great learnings and takeaways provided through John and his firm. So, John, thank you so much.
We do a monthly publication.
Mm.
That's a good point, Ed. It's very short and sweet, but it is any transaction globally in plastics and packaging. We do 2 separate reports that occurred in that month. And we've been tracking this, as I mentioned earlier, since 2005. So we published the trends, some of the key deals, what's going on in the stock market with publicly traded plastics or packaging companies. And it's a quick read, but it gives you a good sense of what's going on in the industry from an M&A perspective. We don't charge for it. You can sign up on our website or you can just call me and we'll add you. But that's a great resource, a way we can stay connected with people. And then I also attend a lot of industry events. I do speak at some of them. Chances are, if you're going to an industry event in plastics or packaging, I'll be there. And so we can meet up there if it makes more sense to connect that way.
Awesome. Awesome. John, thanks so much for taking the time today. We really appreciated your time. It was a great conversation, lots of great takeaways. Again, I've been speaking with John Hart. He's managing director with PMCF. And again, I'm Ed Delia, your host of Growing Up B2B. Thanks for joining us today and have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to Growing Up B2B. To explore more episodes and insights, visit podcast.delianet.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a rating or review on your podcast platform of choice. Having worked with hundreds of family-led businesses across my career, and being a second-generation leader myself, I'm on a mission to help every family business I meet achieve next-level growth for their organization. So feel free also to connect with me on LinkedIn and let's support each other. You can also find out more about my company at delianet.com. Again, I'm your host, Ed Delia, and thanks so much for joining us today. Take care.